Chapter 2. Expectation. Days melted into weeks, and weeks into months, and the foreigner impatiently awaited the great experience, awakening. Each day was the day, and each moment the moment. The Indian is never in a hurry. He knows his work well, and looking wistfully ahead, continues his meditative practice, full of unshakable confidence. But the foreigner, being used to work on a timetable, fixes hour and date as if for an interview. As the clock strikes, he buckles on his belt, sits stiff, shuts his eyes, and waits for the interview. The clock strikes again. He opens his eyes, unbelts himself, and rises, postponing his hope to the evening or the next morning, and so on and on he goes. When many months thus rolled by and nothing startling happened, he cried with all the fervor of his soul, "How long, O Lord, how long?" But lo, what had happened to him? He looked back at his old self and looked at the present one. What a change, good God! And he wondered what could have happened in 6 short months. Then the great secret dawned on him, the secret influence of the divine man in whose radiant ocean he had been daily bathing. The interview, after all, did take place, although the foreigner was not aware of it. Chapter 3. Vanaprastha, forest or ashram life. Thus began the pilgrim's ashram life. Its spirit slowly crept into his hungry soul. For the body, the new life was hard. The change was very drastic. A redeeming feature was that in Ramanashram, unlike in other ashrams, there were no compulsions of any kind, no program to be followed, no meetings, study classes, or bhajan to be attended, so that the body was spared the additional strain of having to rise at an early hour every morning, or be in a certain place at a certain inconvenient time, and so on. Bhagavan was the most liberal of gurus, in that at no time did he consider the need to frame rules and regulations in order to control the lives of his disciples. Nor did he believe in a common enforced discipline, for he himself had attained the highest without them, and had discovered the self-evident truth, illustrated by his own direct experience, that at the right time, realization surges up from within by a free impulse, like the budding and blossoming of a flower. While it is true that not all seekers are as ripe as Bhagavan was, when the flood of realization suddenly inundated him in his 17th year, and thus need a discipline to transform the desultory life of the world to which they are accustomed into that of self-controlled yogis, yet the discipline that is imposed from without can neither bear the desired fruits nor endure. The discipline which is not known to fail is the one which is self-imposed, constitutionally determined, and readily applied by an inner urge of the awakened intellect. Hence Bhagavan left his disciples completely free to mold their lives as best they could. This physical freedom considerably helped me to tide over the first few difficult months of my new existence. The whole month of February 1936, I lived in the ashram in a completely bare room with a sand-covered floor and palm leaves for walls and roof. In March, I started constructing a small hut for my residence in the neighborhood of the ashram, as the next chapter will relate. No sooner was it ready than I moved to it. I hardly stayed in it in the daytime. My mind was wholly fixed on the Master. So I spent my days and a part of my nights in the hall, where the Master lived and slept. There I quietly sat and listened to the visitors' talks with him and to his answers, which were sometimes translated into English, particularly if the questioner was a foreigner or a North Indian, but not always. His answers were fresh and sweet. His influence was all pervasive in his silence, not less than in his speech. To me, in the beginning, this was all the more perceptible in the contrast it offered to the hustle and bustle of the life which I had just turned my back, to the wasted energy, the false values, the foolish expectations from ideals, which are in themselves hollow reeds, the dreary intercourse with people with whom one has very little in common, to the social rules which have been laid down by many generations of selfishness, convention, and superstitions, not to speak of the mess of politics, of rank and wealth, and the bitter jealousy and hatred they breed in the minds of men. It is small wonder, therefore, that Bhagavan appears to the serious-minded as a beacon light in an otherwise impenetrable darkness and a haven of peace. Bhagavan was then enjoying the sound, robust health of middle age and could very well afford to be available at almost all hours of the day to devotees. The years 1936 to 1938 were very blissful, indeed, to us, when we could gather around his couch and speak to him as intimately as to a beloved father, tell him all our troubles, and show him our letters without let or hindrance. After 8 p.m., when the hall contained only the local residents, we sat round him for a family chat till about 10 p.m. Then he related to us stories from the Puranas or the lives of saints, yielding to transportations of emotions when he depicted scenes of great bhakti or great human tragedies to which he was sensitive to the extreme. Then he shed tears which he vainly attempted to conceal. Some stories are memorable, like the following one. Kabir was a great bhakta, a devotee, and lived in or near Benares some centuries ago. Although he had siddhis, or psychic spiritual powers, he earned his livelihood by weaving. One day, when Kabir was working on his looms, a disciple entered in great excitement and said, "Sir, there is a juggler outside here who is attracting large crowds by making his stick stand in the air, and other such things." Thereupon Kabir, who, like all true saints, discouraged the display of jugglery, wanting to shame the man, rushed out with a big ball of thread in hand. Seeing the long bamboo standing in the air, he threw up the ball of thread, which went up and up, unwinding till the whole thread stood still in mid-air and to a far greater height than the juggler's stick, without any support whatever. The people, including the juggler himself, were stunned in amazement, and Sri Bhagavan's eyes acted the amazement, while his hand stood high above his head in the position of that of Kabir when he threw up the ball. On another occasion, Bhagavan recited from memory a poem of the Vaishnava saint, in which occurred the words, "Fold me in thy embrace, O Lord." When the arms of Bhagavan joined in a circle around the vacant air before him, and his eyes shone with devotional ardor, while his voice shook with stifled sobs, which did not escape our notice. It was fascinating to see him acting the part he related and be in such exhilarated moods as these. Some disciples and his attendants used to sleep on the floor of the hall at night. Bhagavan's sleep was very light. He woke every now and then, and almost always he found an attendant nearby fully awake to say a few words to, and slept again. Once or twice he would go out for a few minutes, and by 5 a.m., when the Veda chanters came from the township, they found him fully awake and chatting in a soft, subdued voice. Now the chanting would get started and go on for a little less than an hour, during which everybody abstained from talking, and Bhagavan often sat cross-legged and completely indrawn. Then he went out for a bath, breakfast, and a little stroll on the hill, and returned at about 7:30, when visitors and devotees began trickling in, men and women and children, till they filled the hall by about 9 a.m. This morning hour of the chanting of the Parayanam was the best time of the day for meditation. The congregation was small, women and children were absent, the weather cool, and the mind had not yet completely emerged to run its usual riot. Over and above this, Bhagavan then shone in the stillness of his samadhi, the natural state, the sahaja, which permeated the hall and the meditation of the disciples. But unfortunately, I could not keep up this attendance, nor could I benefit by it even when present, for my mind remained in the fog of somnolence. Being a lifelong bad sleeper, I never succeeded in making the requisite 6 hours sleep before 6 in the morning. Another tendency which I could not completely overcome was intolerance to noise, of which the hall was seldom free. Apart from the free access to it by all and sundry, there was also the freedom of singing, which at times took one by surprise at the moment, when the hall was plunged in silence and the atmosphere conducive to meditation. All of a sudden, a soprano voice rose from somewhere in the hall, intoning some hymn or other, or reciting some sloka in a South Indian language, to be succeeded by a tenor or another soprano, often the latter, in competition with a male of the species, till Bhagavan went out at his usual hours. These were 9:45 for a few minutes, 11 o'clock for lunch, followed by the midday stroll up the Palakotu Sadhu community, and then the evening at 4:45 on the hill, preceded by the evening chanting, and then 7 o'clock for dinner. The best I could do then was to remain in a semi-contemplative or reflective mood, reserving my serious meditation to the quiet solitude of my own room. Major Chadwick, the only other foreign resident then, who had preceded me to the Ramanashram by exactly 3 months, used to wonder how I could meditate in my room at all. I reciprocated by myself, wondering how he could seriously concentrate amidst so much disturbance in the hall. Even in as small a matter as this, it will be observed, individual idiosyncrasies are apparent. These lonely hours I snatched from the time when Bhagavan was out. Every second morning I went alone for Pradakshina, the 8-mile non-stop trek around Arunachala Hill, which took me almost exactly 3 hours to accomplish. This had its own special benefit. At that early hour, I generally was in a walking meditation mood, particularly as I expressly made a habit of it. The benefit of regularity in the practice of sadhana is here fully borne out. Another factor to a successful pradakshina, and to me the greatest, was the determination at the very start not to retrospect, not to look back upon the past throughout the 3-hour trek. I might look this side or that, but would never allow memory to ruin my calmness. Each time I caught memory sneaking in, I immediately brought my attention to the rhythm of my footfalls till the mind regained its restful state. The partial fatigue experienced in the latter half of the journey automatically induced this mental rest without much effort. Somehow this practice worked marvelously well with me. Speaking of retrospection, sadhakas, or spiritual aspirants, must be warned against the tricks of memory, of which nothing is more harmful, nothing more destructive to the peace of mind which is necessary for a successful sadhana. It cannot be too often recommended to them to forbear looking into the past with its trials and errors, acts of omission and commission, regrets, fear and passion, love and hatred, and personal tragedies and such things. Everything is dust, everything transitory, including the seemingly indissoluble human ties, more so wealth and fame, and thus not worth a moment's regret. Nothing is changeless and lasting but the natural state of pure being. Another disturbance in the hall was caused by the distribution of the offerings on the spot, be they mangoes or raisins, sugar candy or dates, or merely puffed rice. The moment one came, it went immediately around, after having been first touched and tasted by Bhagavan, so that he who happened to be then plunged in meditation for an hour or so, on opening the eyes, sometimes found bits of edibles near his feet or in his lap, awaiting his pleasure. This custom was wisely stopped in 1938, when all the offerings were collected and distributed in the dining hall at meal times, or among guests who could not eat the usual food. The constant influx of visitors was of some help in that it afforded the much-needed relaxation to an otherwise tense life. Secondly, the peculiar problems which visitors brought with them were a useful study of the human mind and the endless ills to which it is subject. The problems of the mind and the conditions with which give rise to them are infinitely more numerous than the variety which the physical universe presents to the human senses. Moreover, watching the masterly ways Bhagavan tackled these problems was sadhana in itself. Rationality was the very essence of his arguments, whilst the ultimate answer to all the questions was always the same, namely, find out who you are. He first met every questioner on his own ground, and then slowly steered him round to the source of all problems, the self, the realization of which he held to be the universal panacea. Psychologists deal only with the working of the mind, but Bhagavan goes to the source, the self. It was a wonder that all visitors were agreeably impressed by him, sometimes even without comprehending the drift of his ideas. People take siddhis as the sure sign of perfection, but few understand the subtle influence of the truly perfect being, who, without the deliberate use of miracles, works out the transformation of the people who come into contact with him. More so the genuine disciples, whom he actually turns into muktas, liberated ones, or well on the way to mukti, of which external siddhis are totally incapable. Many of those who have had the inestimable privilege of a long stay with Bhagavan bear witness to the blessedness which his mere presence conferred on them. This is the highest and truest siddhi, which always accompanies jnana, or knowledge of the Self Supreme. When the audience shrank, the master at times became humorously autobiographical about his early school and home life, or about his many experiences on the hill with sadhus and devotees.